Right, good evening everybody. Could we come to order please? And could I start with apologies for absence?
Chairman, apologies from Councillor Philip Cawthorne.
Thank you. Are there any declarations of interest in matters before us this evening? No, if not, can we approve the minutes of the last Cabinet meeting, pages 1 to 12? Are they agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. And to confirm that the business marked Part 1, which are agenda reports 5 to 9, will be heard in public, and Cabinet reports 10 to 11 will be heard in private. So the first report we have this evening, agenda item 5, page 13, review into air quality by the previous Residents and Environmental Services Policy Overview Committee. Councillor Simmons.
Well, thank you, Leader. I'm just going to introduce this item in Councillor Cawthorne's absence. I believe Councillor Bridges is going to present some comments from the Policy Overview Committee. So if it's okay, I'll invite him to do that first and then make a brief further introduction to the report itself. So, Councillor Bridges.
Thank you, Councillor Simmons, and good evening to yourself and the Cabinet. I'm pleased to present to Cabinet the previous Residents Environmental Services Policy Overview Committee's review on air quality in Hillingdon from the past municipal year. Air quality is a significant issue across all areas of the capital, and as members will be aware, Hillingdon is no exception. The committee undertook a range of witness sessions with a variety of internal and external representatives, including hearing from an independent air quality expert. Members appreciated how insightful these witness sessions were to assist them in their review. The committee found that the Council had come a long way in terms of recognising the triggers and regulating air quality. However, it was also acknowledged that there was still work to be done to meet residents' concerns. The committee made a number of recommendations which request the Cabinet to consider as part of the upcoming review of the Council's Air Quality Action Plan. These include maintaining a strong focus on school travel plans, exploring measures to tackle car and coach idling emissions, promoting services available for residents such as the air text service and pollution updates, reviewing air quality monitoring networks, and enhancing the existing work the Council takes to promote greener and healthier alternatives to driving. Finally, on behalf of the previous committee, I'd like to thank the councillors, witnesses and officers that supported this review. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Bridges, and I'd be most grateful if you could take back the thanks of Cabinet to those members of the committee who are still serving for the work that they've put in to this report. So one of the reasons why I personally am introducing this in Councillor Cawthorne's absence is because clearly from the recommendations and from the detail in the report there is quite a focus on the impact that air quality problems have on children, and we know younger lungs are more vulnerable to the damage which both particulates and gases and other things that are involved in air pollution can cause. And it's also a big issue for our older residents as well. So part of the factor behind excess deaths that occur during heat waves like the one that we're currently experiencing is we know that poor air quality can lead to frail elderly people suffering, and that impact on their health can then lead to even more serious medical conditions and in some cases to death. And I think many members will have seen the publicity concerning one case elsewhere in London, which is concerning the quite direct impact that's being identified of traffic pollution, essentially, from the South Circular on one child who subsequently died, who had the condition of asthma. And the coroner in that case has said that that was a causal factor. So what we as a council are doing about this is important on lots of different levels. It's important to our older residents, important to our younger residents. It's important to all of those who care for those different groups of people to show that we are taking practical steps. In terms of the recommendations, focus on school travel plans, quite helpful, so that whether it's the highly visible causes of pollution, of people sitting idling their engines for long periods of time outside schools, which remains a problem that I hear about quite a lot from head teachers and from parents, through to ideas that affect and benefit all residents, like the work on alerting people. And I think it's worth making the link to the work the Council is doing to oppose the expansion of Heathrow Airport, because when we look in the report at the map showing the areas of greatest pollution, it's very clear that transport is the major driver, but in particular the movement of surface vehicles around Heathrow Airport connected with the aircraft coming in and out is a major contributor. And given that we remain so far in excess of the EU air quality limits because of the activity at Heathrow, it's absolutely clear that we as a council need to continue the campaign for that reason as well as others. So I think this is an enormously helpful report. The Cabinet will be very happy to take on board all of the recommendations, but I think it's something that we are going to have to continue to revisit in the light of what other agencies in London are doing, and also the fact that we are learning more and more every day about how we can mitigate the impact that poor air quality has on the lives of our residents. So I move the recommendations 1 to 6, page 14.
Thank you. Interesting that you mentioned the Heathrow case. I was with the Borough Solicitor finalising my witness statement today, which had the history of Heathrow past the last time we took a legal challenge. And interestingly enough, back around 2009, 2010, Heathrow were maintaining that by the time the third runway they were then proposing was built, by 2020, they would meet air quality conditions. Now, they haven't got a third runway, and they still haven't met them, so not a dog's chance of them meeting them, and it will be a major part of our judicial review application. Are the recommendations agreed? Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Bridges. Agenda item 6, revised financing scheme for schools. Councillor Simmons.
Well, thank you, Leader. I seem to go for a number of Cabinet meetings with few reports on the agenda to present, and this evening I've got several. This is quite a technical paper, actually. Although scheme for financing schools sounds like it's going to be quite exciting and strategic, it isn't really. It's more an update to the regulations that govern the financial relationship between the council and the schools in the borough. It's derived from the various different pieces of guidance, advice that come from the Department for Education, and we do from time to time update it to reflect that, and also to update things that are emerging from the work that we do directly with the schools in the borough. And examples of that, as the schools have increasingly become academies, the financial relationship has changed, so we need to take account of that. As schools' response to funding pressures has changed, we need to consider the way in which we provide financial support to them and the process that we follow to make sure that it is the best practice that it possibly can be. So I move the recommendation that we adopt the new scheme for financing schools, and clearly for those members who are very keen to see it, there are highlights in here indicating where it's a variation from the previous scheme for financing schools which has been in operation.
Yeah. Agenda item 7, update to Hillingdon Local Development Scheme. Councillor Burrows.
Thank you, Leader. The current local development scheme was published by the Council in January 2016 and is considered at the moment to be out of date. And therefore, under the provisions of the Planning Compulsory Purchase Act, we're required to publish an up-to-date LDS so that it does not affect any further local plans going through the processes, because it can stall that. And if it stalls that, then obviously we've got issues as a council with how we're going to develop our planning policies, etc., and our strategies. So the recommendations here are the recommendation 1 and 2 on page 99. Endorse and recommends that the local development scheme is referred to full council, because that's where it has to go for adoption. And recommendation 2 grants delegated authority to the Deputy Chief Executive, Corporate Director of Resident Services to agree, in conjunction with myself as Cabinet Member, any editing textual changes to the local development scheme prior to submission to full council. I so move those 2 recommendations.
Thank you. Any comments on that? If not, could I just remind executive scrutiny, this is going to council for debate, so it's not worth spending too much time on that one tonight. Is the recommendations agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Agenda item 8, page 115, Council Budget 2018-19, the monthly budget monitoring report for month 2. Councillor Bianco.
Thank you, Leader. Well, as the title suggests, this is the monthly budget monitoring report for month 2, and month 2 in this case is May of this year. It shows an encouraging position for so early on in the year. It is, as I've said many years, when at this point in the year. It is at the early parts of the year where typically it takes a bit of getting going before we start to see savings and what have you come through. But to be at this point, 2 months in, and being underspent by a little over 100,000 is a very good start. There are obviously many slips and whatever that can befall us between now and the end of the year, but we're starting in the right direction, so I would regard it, as I'm sure you'd expect me to, as a good news story. There are 8 recommendations on the paper on page 115 and 116, and there is a further recommendation 9 on the addendum sheet. Now, there are quite a few things one could talk about here in terms of where we are with balances and savings. The savings position actually is a good one, because more than 3/4 of what we're looking to save this year has already been either delivered or is on track for delivery. So that's a very good position to be so early on. From a capital perspective, the underspend is currently showing 6.5 million, but I think it's fair to say it's a very early point to really draw any useful conclusions as to where we're going to end up on that. So I know you all have things to add, Leader, so at this point I will move those 9 recommendations and leave it there.
Thank you, Councillor Bianco. As you say, this is the position at the end of May, and that's the first recommendation that we note that position. The Treasury Management Update is shown at Appendix E on page 153, and that is very much as it has been in months gone by, not any major change there. And on page 155 you'll find Appendix F, which is the assignments, consultancy and agency assignments that are approved by myself and the Chief Executive. The ongoing ones that run up over 50k are detailed there. Recommendation 4 is to delegate authority to myself and to you, Councillor Bianco, in conjunction with the Deputy Chief Executive, regarding all necessary procurement and financial decisions in respect of building contracts that we're going to do at Acol Crescent. And this is 19 general needs and 14 shared ownership housing units. Recommendation 5 is to accept a capital grant of 205k from the Department of Education in respect of the Healthy Pupils Capital Fund. Recommendation 6, accept an award of 200k from Transport for London in respect of the Borough Principal Roads Programme. Recommendation 7, agree to fund a lease for a horse to support a local Paralympic athlete at a cost of 8k per annum for up to 3 years. This is Natasha Baker, who is a local girl who has won Olympic gold in the past 2 Olympics, and unfortunately the last horse she had, I think it's passed away or it's gone out to grass or whatever, but it's so she has a new horse which she's leasing for up to 3 years, which will see her through the next Olympics. This is a contribution towards the cost, and we've agreed that we will fund her in that endeavour. Recommendation 8, agree an annual grant for the current year of £81,000 to the Metropolitan Police Service for a variety of activities, including 12-month leasing of semi-marked police cars, proactive operations to tackle drug misuse and support for responses to domestic abuse cases. Again, that's a very sort of worthwhile thing for us to do. And there is an additional recommendation, recommendation 9, and this is to ratify a special urgency decision taken by myself and Councillor Bianco this week to agree the appointment of a company to undertake replacement of CCTV systems at various town centre locations across the borough under a single action tender. The town centres are shown on the recommendation, and they will all have upgraded CCTV cameras, and that recommendation is noting that urgency decision. As you say, Councillor Bianco, it's a very good position to be in at month 2, particularly around the savings. To have 7.8 million of 10.6 already banked is good. Obviously, the last bit is always the hardest bit to get, but to have that amount in the bank, literally at this stage, is good. There's also a surplus, predicted surplus on the collection fund, business rates and council tax of just over £1 million, which will go into next year's budget. So at the moment we're predicting general fund balances of about 39.5 million at the year end. So a pretty sound position to be in. Councillor Simmons.
Well, thank you, Leader. Just a couple of observations. One, a more strategic one. I think many members will have seen some publicity today that the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government have made some announcements about the future business rates pilots, in which they've indicated that there will be a reduction in the proportion of the business rates collected which local authorities can expect to retain. And clearly, I think that demonstrates the wisdom of the decision that we've taken in the past, not to simply incorporate that as part of our day-to-day expenditure, but to treat it with some degree of caution. And clearly we'll be watching that space to see what happens, because that was a significant sum of money. But just two particular points. One, I'd like to draw members' attention to page 138 and the references on there to different elements of the school's budget. The council has provided a lot of support to schools to assist with mitigating financial pressures they may be facing, such as the introduction of schools' procurement officers to help to make the procurement process more efficient and less costly for schools over the years. But what is clear from the figures that are quoted for the Central Schools Services block and the High Needs block in particular is that Schools Forum, which is the decision-making body over the school's budget, is not yet getting to grips with the financial challenges that schools face collectively. So whilst there are many individual institutions that are well managed, including some that have very large surplus balances, the overall picture, which is set out in paragraph 94, is of an accumulating overspend by schools in the borough. Now that is offset by the fact that overall there are significant balances held by schools in the borough at present. But it's clear when we look across London and we look across the wider context of English maintained schools that the financial pressures are resulting in growing overspends. There are a number of things which the council is doing which will help to mitigate this. In particular, the overspend on the high needs block will be reduced by the creation of additional free academy school places in the borough. So the Orchard Hill Trust, with whom we've worked very closely, and the Eden Trust, with whom we work very closely, are creating local places which will help to reduce some of the overspends around that. But I think we need to be very clear that as an authority our position has always been that we don't interfere with what goes on in the dedicated schools grant. It is for our schools to decide how they spend that money, but that includes the need for them to put their house in order when it comes to overspends which they're now facing. And we will continue to put pressure on the Schools Forum to get to grips with that problem. And then just finally on the point about the lease on the horse, which is the kind of slightly eccentric thing which I'm sure will attract some wider attention. But certainly when I visited schools for children with special education needs, and particularly physical disabilities, access to sports in this borough is an incredibly important part of improving quality of life. And we've always made sure, through things like HOAC, through Family Fishing Fun Days, through access to all our facilities, that we make sure that children with disabilities can access them as well. And I think there's a really positive story here that I've heard from parents of disabled children in this borough, how a scheme called Writing for the Disabled has helped their children to get confidence to access sport. And I think we need to make sure that this is seen as the really positive story it is, because not every borough has a Paralympian gold medalist that they can demonstrate as a figurehead. And I think making sure that that inspiration that provides is shared with as many local children and families as possible will be a really good thing, because it just demonstrates that this is a borough where inclusion is not just about being a provider at one end of the market, it's about absolutely going for world-class participation in sport and showing our residents that that's the kind of thing that they can aspire to, even if life may seem difficult because of the disability that they're faced with.
Thank you. I should have said that Natasha has indeed offered to do exactly that and share her experiences with children as part of this. Any other comments? If not, our recommendations 1 to 9 agreed. Thank you. Agenda item 9, former adult education centre at Laurel Lane Primary School Academy lease, West Drayton. Councillor Bianco.
Thank you, Leader. Well, this is what happens every time where Academy Trust comes along, we have to grant them a lease of the land in question. And that is what recommendation 1 demonstrates. Recommendation 2 is that we are going to give them a grant of $35,000 towards the cost of the refurbishment of the former adult education centre, which will obviously benefit them and the youth of that area, surprisingly perhaps, but going forward as well. So it's pretty straightforward. The second point is well worth noting, and I move those 2 recommendations at the bottom of page 159.
Thank you, Councillor Bianco. This has been around for a little while. The school obviously have their lease. When that occurred, the adult education centre wasn't part of the lease. The school asked if we could incorporate it, which we were willing to do, on the understanding that the school could demonstrate that they had the funds to actually bring it into the school site. They had the funds, all bar 35k, which we will contribute towards it, so it becomes part of the school. So they get a lease on the old adult education centre, incorporated into their school lease, and a grant of 35,000, which it shows, if you look at the financial costs, that while we have no specific budget for that sort of things, it is a one-off. We do have a budget of just over £2.4 million in the youth provision capital budget, which, considering we haven't got a youth champion, is quite remarkable. So I thought so. Councillor Simmons.
Yes, and just I'm grateful to Councillor Bianco for his commendable concern about the youth in this particular area. I just would ask him to note that this is, of course, very close to the youth centre which the council runs in West Drayton, which provides a number of different facilities. And although clearly the adults who access adult education will continue, as they do at the moment, to access the new state-of-the-art adult education centre which the council has provided, as well as courses which are run at the refurbished library, which the council provides, and access to a number of other services. All of those residents will, of course, have the opportunity to benefit from the new swimming pool, which is in the planning stage for the local area as well.
Are those recommendations agreed? Okay, we now move to part 2.